The boots came first. Before any cannon was loaded, before any officer traced a line on a map, before any drummer beat the march, the boots had to exist. 200,000 pairs of them, leather cut, shaped, stitched, and distributed across a continent that barely had roads wide enough for two carts to pass each other. The Grande Armée did not move the way armies had moved before. It moved the way nothing had ever moved. And the men who made it possible were not always the ones carrying muskets. Napoleon understood something that most commanders of his era refused to accept. An army that cannot eat, cannot fight. The elegance of his battlefield maneuvers. The flanking movements. The corps arriving exactly when the line was breaking. None of it existed without the invisible structure underneath. The wagons. The roads. The magazines buried deep in towns the soldiers would never remember. The math of calories per man per day, multiplied by weeks on the road, multiplied by terrain that swallowed supplies like sand swallows water. The corps system was the first revolution. Before Napoleon, European armies moved as a single massive body, slow, vulnerable, dependent on a supply line that stretched behind them like a tail that could be cut at any moment. He divided the Grande Armée into self-contained corps, each one between 15 and 30,000 men, each one carrying its own artillery, its own cavalry, its own infantry, its own command structure. A corps could fight alone for a full day if it had to. It could survive without the rest of the army long enough for the rest of the army to arrive. Those corps did not march in columns on the same road. They spread across parallel routes, separated sometimes by a full day's march, covering ground in a way that looked like chaos from above, but was precise from the inside. The separation solved two problems at once. It prevented the roads from collapsing under the weight of 200,000 men walking the same path. Because roads in 1805 were not roads in any modern sense. They were packed earth that turned to mud in rain and dust in heat, and a single corps could reduce a passable track to an impassable trench in a single morning. The spread also meant the army could forage across a wider band of territory, pulling food from villages and farms across a front of 50 miles, rather than stripping a single corridor bare within hours. Foraging was not looting, or it was not supposed to be. The system had rules, written ones, enforced with varying degrees of seriousness, depending on the officer in charge and how hungry the men were. Designated soldiers called vivandières and maréchaussées in their different roles were responsible for acquiring food from local populations, often against paper receipts that promised payment later. The payment sometimes came. Often it did not. But the receipts mattered because they preserved the fiction that the army was passing through a population, not consuming it. A fiction that kept roads open and locals from poisoning wells. The magazines were the backbone of everything the foraging system could not guarantee. Before a campaign began, sometimes months before the first soldier crossed the border, supply depots were constructed at calculated intervals along the projected route of advance. These were not improvised stockpiles. They were engineered stores: wheat, dried meat, biscuit, fodder for horses, positioned based on estimated march rates, expected consumption, and the geography of roads between one river and the next. Napoleon's chief of staff, Berthier, maintained files of such detail that he could tell an aide how many days of bread existed at a depot 300 kilometers ahead before breakfast was finished. The horse problem was the one that never fully solved itself. The Grande Armée of 1805 moved approximately 170,000 horses, cavalry mounts, artillery teams, wagon horses, officer horses, remount reserves. Each horse consumed roughly 10 times what a man consumed in weight. A cavalry horse needed 12 kilograms of fodder per day just to maintain the condition needed for combat. Multiply that across the full animal strength of the army, and the numbers become almost incomprehensible. Over 2 million kilograms of fodder required every single day, from a landscape that was already being stripped by the men walking through it. The artillery moved slower than everything else, and the artillery was the reason battles could be won at all. A 12-pound cannon weighed over 1,000 kilograms before its carriage, before its ammunition chest, before the horses that pulled it. Moving a single battery of 8 guns across a river crossing required engineering work that could take an entire day. Napoleon's army carried pontoon bridges, flat-bottomed boats that could be assembled into a crossing in hours, pulled by dedicated teams whose only job was those bridges. When the Danube had to be crossed, when the Rhine had to be crossed, those teams worked through the night while the rest of the army waited on the bank. Communication across 200,000 men, spread over 50 miles of countryside, ran on horse and paper. An order written at headquarters in the morning might reach the corps it was meant for 6 hours later, by which time the situation had changed completely. Napoleon compensated for this with a command philosophy that most military thinkers of his era could not quite understand. He told his corps commanders what he wanted the result to be, not always exactly how to achieve it. Marshal Davout at Auerstedt in 1806 received orders that assumed he would face a small rearguard. He found himself facing half the Prussian army instead. He attacked anyway, with 30,000 men against 60,000, and won, because he understood the intention behind the orders well enough to act without waiting for new ones. The roads themselves had to be managed the way a general manages troops. Engineers rode ahead of the advance to assess conditions, repair bridges before the army arrived, widen passes where the columns would inevitably compress. The pontonniers, the bridge-building corps, were considered elite, paid more than standard infantry, recruited for physical strength and technical skill. When they arrived at a river crossing ahead of the main column, the locals sometimes watched them work with the kind of disbelief reserved for things that should not be possible. A full pontoon bridge over a moderate river, assembled from wagons that had followed the army for a week, finished before dawn. The soldiers themselves carried everything they could not get from the land. The standard French infantryman in the Grande Armée carried a load of approximately 30 kilograms. Musket, bayonet, cartridge box with 60 rounds, 3 days of biscuit, a canteen, a greatcoat rolled over one shoulder, spare boots tied to the outside of the pack. The boots were the difference between an effective soldier and a casualty before contact with the enemy. Foot problems, blisters that became infections, infections that became amputations, removed more soldiers from the 1805 campaign than Austrian muskets did. The army knew this. Cobblers traveled with the corps. Spare leather traveled in wagons. It was not enough. The march rates that made Napoleon's campaign seem almost magical to his enemies were not magic. They were discipline and terrain selection. A French corps marched between 25 and 30 kilometers per day on good roads in reasonable weather, and could push to 40 kilometers in a forced march when the situation required it. An Austrian army of the same period expected to cover 15. The difference was not physical, it was organizational. French soldiers did not wait for the supply train to arrive before they moved. They moved and expected the supply system to find them. When it did not, they found the food themselves. When they could not find it, they marched hungry, which they did regularly, and more often than the official histories of the campaigns admitted. The system broke under its own weight when the distances became too great. The 1812 Russian campaign was not a failure of courage or strategy alone. It was a failure of logistics at a scale the machinery simply could not sustain. The distances from the Polish frontier to Moscow were more than twice the distances of any previous campaign. The magazine system required depots that could not be built fast enough. The foraging system required villages that kept disappearing, burned by retreating Russians before the French arrived. The horse mortality rate in the first month was catastrophic because the grass on the Russian steppe in June was not yet mature enough to sustain animals in hard work. Horses died by the tens of thousands before a major battle had even been fought. What the Russian campaign revealed was the true limit of what the Grande Armée had always been, a machine precisely calibrated for the distances and terrain of Central Europe and nothing else. In Germany, in Austria, in Prussia, in Italy, the system worked because the supply lines were short enough, the roads were dense enough, and the populations large enough to feed an army moving through them. Russia offered none of those things. The land was vast, and the people had left it. The roads were few, and the distances were enormous. The machine that had been assembled over a decade of European campaigning arrived at the edge of its operational range and kept moving anyway, because stopping felt worse than continuing. The men who kept the army alive were rarely celebrated. The commissary officers, the wagon masters, the farriers, the bakers attached to each division, the clerks who tracked consumption rates and updated the supply rosters. These were not the figures who appeared in the paintings. The paintings showed cavalry charges and the artillery smoke and marshals on white horses. They did not show the bread ovens that traveled with the army in converted wagons, baking through the night so that the infantry would have something to eat before the march resumed at dawn. They did not show the teams of 12 men pulling a stuck artillery piece through a meter of mud at 3 in the morning because it had to be in position before sunrise. The scale of what moved across Europe between 1805 and 1812 had no precedent in the history of organized warfare. Previous armies had been large. Roman legions had sustained themselves on campaign for years. But no single operational force had ever been asked to move this many men, this many animals, this much equipment, across this much territory, in this little time. The Austerlitz campaign, 6 weeks from the Rhine to the battlefield in Moravia, covered nearly 1,000 kilometers and ended with one of the most decisive victories the continent had ever seen. It worked because every piece of the system functioned as designed, because the roads held, because the magazines were full, and because the men believed, perhaps irrationally, that the food would be there when they arrived. What remained, after the campaigns ended and the empire collapsed, was not the tactics. Other armies had tactics. What remained? In military manuals, in staff college curriculum, in the notebooks of officers who had served and survived and rebuilt armies for a different century, was the structure, the core system, the parallel march, the forward depot, the separation of strategic intent from tactical execution, the idea that an army was not a weapon but an organism, and that organisms required feeding, and that feeding them was not a problem secondary to the fighting, but prior to it, always prior to it, more important than almost anything else, because the battle that could not be reached was already lost before it began.